If you look at what we've gone is that we've gone to try to establish how much forage a horse eats, and then that we have to supplement nutrients over and above what the forage does not meet. I think this is most effectively done with a well-designed commercial feed, but there are different ways to skin the cat. The first supplement we're probably going to think about maybe is energy, and this is going to be provided by grain or grain products. All right, and I'll go through those. The second would be minerals, typically trace minerals, but also some macro minerals. And rare is it that you really need to supplement with vitamins. That's the kind of the bellwether thing you have to supplement with. So the physical form of these things vary. One is straights or straight grains. The second would be textured feeds, and by textured feed, I mean molasses feed. They call it muesli in Europe. Third, by pelleted feeds, and then the fourth, granular vitamin and mineral supplements. Those would be the way that we do it. Does it matter? If you're feeding a concentrate, does it matter if it's a straight and a mixing pellet, or a textured feed, or a cube, or a pellet? That's right, as long as they'll eat it, it's good. It's totally a person choice. The horse typically doesn't care. And I have clients that said 25 years ago, I'm not going to feed pellets to my horses. That's chook feed. You know, the way they get pellets is whatever they sweep up off the mill floor and run through the pellet mill that's what you're getting. And then I have other people that would feed nothing other than a pellet. And then I have others that feed oats and a supplement pellet. So it's a person decision. And the horse typically, if you use palatable ingredients, the horse typically does not mind. Straights typically from ever, oats were the popular grain supplement, weren't they? Traditional, like Timothy Hay. Others would be corn, barley, wheat, or wheat byproducts like wheat mids or wheat bran or wheat red dog. There are lots of DDG, which is distillers' dried grains with solubles, or brewers' grains. There are lots of different grain byproducts that we can use. Beet pulp. Where does beet pulp come from? Beets, right? Beet pulp is a byproduct of the sugar industry, all right? And they extract the sugar out of the sugar beets, and the part that's left is kind of a fruit pectin, and it's what we call a super fiber. And we use that a lot, and I use it a lot in a lot of my prep diets for prepping horses for sales and for racehorse diets, because it's very, very highly digestible. It's high in fiber, low in starch, low in sugar, but you still have good DE value. So if you got a horse eating a lot of feed, it makes it less dangerous to feed more of it. So what about oats? Good feed, bad feed, mama feed? Mama means so-so in Japanese. Oats are a good starch source. They run, depending on where they're grown, 8 to 12% protein. Great starch source. The starch in oats is highly digestible pre-cecally. Like we're talking about 86% of the starch in oats is digested prior to the time that the ingesta gets to the cecum. Is that important? Absolutely, it's important, because you don't want a lot of excess carbohydrate entering the hindgut and being fermented by the bacteria there. All right. Corn is higher in starch than oats, but it's only unprocessed. About 38% of the starch is digested before it gets to the cecum. So when we were studying laminitis and so on, the classic experimental model we used was cornstarch overload. And that's because much of the starch reach the hindgut and could, not always, but you sometimes could produce the symptoms that made a horse founder. Barley, we don't feed as much anymore, but barley is a good source of nutrients. So those are the main ones. What's wrong with these things? Oats are 0.08% calcium, 0.36% phosphorus. Is that good or bad? It's backwards, isn't it? Okay, it's upside down. Oats are about 5 to 8 parts per million copper. Oats have very low lysine. So oats are a great energy source, nearly full stop. So we add things like soybean meal or flaxseed meal to oats a lot of times to get the protein concentration in the diet up some. So all of these grains, these straights, are good energy source, but really terrible sources of vitamins and minerals. All right, so if you feed oats and Timothy hay, you're going to be deficient in a lot of nutrients for that horse. So you need to try to put together textured feeds or whatever that'll help. Textured feeds are a combination of grain products, pellets, vitamins. Most of them have a little mixing pellet, M30, or what are we using? STAM, Grow and Win, a very concentrated 26% protein to 30% pellet that's in that feed that is the carrier for the vitamins and minerals. All right, and then they have molasses, usually around 8%. They may have beet pulp, they have other things, and it's a balanced kind of a deal. If I were a horse, I would a hell of a lot rather eat textured feed than pellets. All right? Because it looks like you put a little milk on it and have it for breakfast yourself, doesn't it? It looks very palatable, and it is. And from this tall, I fed sweet feed. All right, we call it sweet feed or textured feed or molasses feed. And I changed at my farm to cubes about 5 years ago, about as big as my index finger. Because I'm feeding everything outside most of the time. And if you're feeding outside in pots, what's the first thing that a horse wants to do when you pour it into that pot? Dump it in the damn mud. All right, isn't it? You know, I have one mare that's expert, and she waits till I'm looking, and she puts her foot on the edge of that thing, and she presses down and spills it into the mud. So I got tired of that. I got tired of flies, and I got tired of these horses that could go through my textured feed and eat every oat and then eat every corn and leave every pellet, which was what I really wanted them to eat, which they can do, you know, with their nimble mouths. So I changed to a pellet. And basically, a pellet is as good as the ingredients that go in it. And I would say at this point, probably 70% of my clients in Central Kentucky use cubes, and 30% still use textured feeds. Now, what we do is that we feed our mares cubes, pellets. We feed our foals pellets, the yearlings, up until about June on cubes. And then those horses that are going to the sale, we change to a textured feed, to a sweet feed. Because we can put more fat in it, you know, more oil without making it nasty, and we can use some beet pulp, and if we need to give a horse a little bute or whatever, some kind of medication as we go through, it tends to be more palatable that way, either that or with a dose syringe that we have to give it. So we typically use this fairly energy intense prep feed in a textured form. But it's like there are many reasons to think that a cube probably is better, in that they can't sort ingredients. It's more difficult for them to waste it. And there's the old reason to use textures, in that I can see the quality of the oat. I can see the grain type deal. But most commercial feed companies can't afford not to produce a good product. And if I looked at the feed tag for Purina and Nutrina and Poland Grain and McCauley Brothers and Hallway Feeds and any other company, most of them are as close as damn it to the same. Like if you look down through there and you look at the amount of copper and the amount of zinc and the vitamin A levels and everything, is that they're pretty similar across the board. So it's like these guys, most of them have decent nutritionists, and I think horse people are tough enough consumers that if they look at feed tags and there's a pretty palpable difference in nutrient specs, they're probably going to move on to the next one. And 90% of these feeds are over-fortified. By over-fortified, I mean they have way under more trace minerals than they have to have. They typically may have more macro minerals than they have to have. So I don't remember in the last 20 years having done evaluations on more than 2 places, farms, where I thought I was looking at a deficiency. But I don't remember in the hundreds that I've done in that time not looking at total nutrient intake and thinking, am I overdoing this thing? You know, have I got too high levels? So deficiencies in horses, nutrient deficiencies in horses, have become somewhat of historical significance only. Nutritional excesses have become the norm. And that doesn't matter for a lot of different nutrients. I'm going to skip. That's my fox. Well, no, that's a Noble Mission foal that I sold to Japan for a lot of money. Can't outrun a fat man. That's my fox hunter on the far left, along with some information on protein intake that I'm going to skip. So I'm going to skip all of these nutrients and how much, you know, what you feed to different classes of horses until later. So I think this is important. Probably the biggest mistake that people make in feeding horses today is over rather than under fortification of most nutrients. You know, just feeding too much. Let me give you an example. Most commercial feeds right now are 50 parts per million copper. And that's, again, 50 milligrams per kilo, right? The highest copper requirement we know is 150 milligrams of copper per day for a lactating mare. So if I'm feeding a feed that's 50 parts per million copper and I'm feeding a lactating mare 6 kilos of that feed, how much copper am I feeding the mare? 600 milligrams. Is it going to turn her into a penny? I don't think so. But it's not good nutrition to me, of just saying that there is no upper limit. But all of these feeds typically are fortified in a manner such that if you're feeding them close to the amount of feed that they need, trace minerals are not going to be a problem. Now, what is the deal with copper or zinc? Back in 1985, there was a study done by Debbie Knight and Larry Bramlage and Steve Reed in Ohio that said that farms that were feeding higher levels of copper and zinc had lower incidence of OCD. We called it OCD then, DOD, developmental orthopedic disease. And so consequently, copper became the panacea. And whereas I didn't know how much copper was in a diet, we went to that about being very specific about the amount of copper and zinc that's in a diet. Has it fixed OCD? Has it improved it some? Maybe, probably. But it was an overreaction to a field study that just really hasn't panned out. But if you talk to a lot of people, they'll swear that the cause of DOD in horses is a copper deficiency. And we fed enough copper and zinc to turn them into a penny or to galvanize them, and we haven't gotten a huge response in terms of the incidence of these problems. So we have to be careful about my feed tag's bigger than your feed tag deal. You know, I got 80 parts per million copper and yours only has 50. Well, why do you need 80? Unless it's a supplement pellet. All right. So again, nutritional math becomes important. Luckily, horses are fairly tolerant of all the things that we do to them, nutritionally and otherwise. Okay, so I'm going to start and I'm going to run out of time, looks like. I'm going to start with just a brief kind of synopsis of feeding different classes of horses. I'm going to start with feeding the broodmare because I think that's where everything positive or negative starts. You know, if we get this wrong, I think that a lot of other things are going to be wrong too. So I like to start with the factory, that being the broodmare. This is a mare called Quiet Giant. She hasn't been very productive so far. She had this cheap old horse named Gun Runner that was her first foal. And she was a Ned Evans mare, and she's at 3 Chimneys, and she's late pregnant. So the different classes of mares that we want to look at are barren and maiden mares, pregnant mares like this, and then lactating mares. And each one of those groups of horses have distinct different nutrient requirements, all right, and opportunities that we have to influence their progeny and their productivity and their resistance to disease and so on forth down the list. The first would be barren and maiden mares. Condition should be, feeding should be condition dependent. All right. In other words, feed this mare in a manner such that you can achieve appropriate condition, which is probably a condition score 5 or 5.5. All right. It's environment dependent. It gives you an opportunity to adjust condition. You know, what's one of the biggest problems we have with these mares now? Obesity. Mares getting too damn fat. Pardon the French. So it gives us an opportunity for barren mares anyway, for us to reduce their condition. And I've used muzzles, grazing muzzles on these mares very effectively. If I have a mare that I think is pathologically obese, I've used dry lots on them, or partial dry lots, because some of these mares they're insulin insensitive or have metabolic syndrome or have enough fat that they are not functioning correctly, just like humans that are too heavy. Assess contribution of forage, adjust the condition if necessary, and feed intake, grain intake can be from 0 to 9 pounds feed per day, typically, depending on the condition of the horse, plus forage. All right, so it's pretty easy for these mares that are loafing on you. If you look at the basic requirements here, the thing I want you to see if you compare maiden mares to barren mares is that the only difference in their requirements is energy, calories, and protein. Mineral requirements are the same, trace mineral requirements. Vitamin requirements, it's 15,000 IU of vitamin A, which is a very low requirement. The only thing that varies between barren mares and maiden mares is typically the amount of energy that they get. There's some specific things about maidens that I think are important for you. First of all, are these barren maidens? Are they mares that went to the racetrack and are being retired? Are they mares that didn't go to the racetrack because they had a structural issue, but great genetics that you kept. What's their history? And this is going to have a lot to do with how I'm going to manage these mares nutritionally. The second thing is, for these fillies, the time of retirement is really, really key, is critical from the standpoint of reproductive performance. I would like to have a mare back in September, or I would like to have her back on the way back to her stall in her last race. You follow me? If I get her back in September, October, I have a chance for this mare to take a nosedive and then start to thrive again before she goes under lights to breed and get her condition right. If she comes from the racetrack, she may be thin, what we consider thin, but metabolically she's at a really high point. And a lot of these mares will cycle 2 weeks off the racetrack. You breed them and they're in foal immediately. Whereas if you get them in December and you want to breed them in February, a lot of the times they just don't do right if you're not real careful. So what we want to do is again, for me, I want this filly back in September. Or I want her off the racetrack, after her last race. I think you need to prepare for their transitional success, transition being from a race filly to a broodmare. And what a lot of people are inclined to do is they bring these fillies home that have lived in a stall for 2 years or 3 years or whatever. They have been given a bath every day, have had their soles paired out excessively for 2 years, and their feet minimized for 2 years. And the first thing they do is they jerk their damn shoes and turn them out with a group of hardened criminals and wonder why in the hell they go backwards. So when I bring a mare back from the racetrack, I actually put her on a TLC program. I might pull her hind shoes. I'd prefer actually not to even do that. I'll reset her maybe in front if she's low in her heel and long in her toe. I won't touch her sole for the first couple of times that I trim her. I'll let her go through 2 resets in front before I pull her shoes. I'll keep her up if I have to some in the night. And just, she's been 2 years, she gets the best of everything. She gets the best feed, she gets the best bedding, she gets the best drugs. She gets the best of everything. So I bring them home and I give them that, continue with the TLC. Most of them been eating 15 pounds of feed per day on the racetrack. So I'm going to bring her home and dump her out in the overstocked pasture and feed her a quart, because she's not running anymore, is she? I'm going to continue to try to feed her enough feed that I can add some condition and prepare her for the breeding season. Because I want this mare to get some fat cover. All right, I want her to get some condition on her. And I think that preparation during this time is going to pay big dividends when this mare lays down and has her first foal. If you have a mare in a really negative energy balance when she's bred and you don't get some condition on them, I think that impacts on foal weight. And if you look at weight of foals from maidens, it already is much lower than it is for multi-paris mares. So I want to drive this mare a little bit so that I can drive the foaling process. So you need to understand what her nutritional past was, that she's been on a lot of groceries. Understand what her social past was. She hadn't been turned out with a bunch of tough old mares that are going to kick her and bite her and so on. So what you do during this letdown period really has a dramatic effect on foal weight, which is, what is going to drive mature weight, which is what's going to drive her commercial value of the yearling or weanling. So you have a lot of opportunity to get it wrong or get it right here. Socialization, I've talked about trying to get her out with quieter mares so that she doesn't have a lot of stress. Deciding whether you use lights or masks. Any of you ever used Equilume? I've used them since Barbara invented them, and I wouldn't do it any other way. You know, all of my Baron mares, of which is one maiden mare this year, my dang vet, he just doesn't get it right. We had 100% conception rate last year, and he doesn't contribute a nickel to paying my dang stud fees. And I figured for him to get about 6 of those mares in foal, and he just doesn't get it. So I've used these masks for a long time. And I remember one year I had 5 empty mares, a couple of them maidens and a couple of them empty. And we had a horribly cold winter in Kentucky. And the only problem I had with any of those mares I had in mask was in a mare that had a foot abscess, and I brought her up into the barn to take care of that abscess, and she ended up having a little impaction colic. And the mares that were outside never turned a hair. The only one is a mare that came up into the barn. So I'm a believer. Besides that, use of these masks probably saved my marriage because my wife got tired of cleaning stalls. But it's a great invention to me. And they've got new ones where you can replace the battery, just the light. And so it's not the full 500. I think it's 230 or something like that for the cup to do them. Pregnant mares. Let's call them pregnant non-lactating mares, all right? Because we're going to treat the lactating mare different than the pregnant mare. During the first 2 trimesters of pregnancy, this mare has the same requirement as a mature mare as a mare at maintenance, all right? She doesn't have an accelerated requirement for nutrients. You know, we're not feeding, the minute we see that first ultrasound, we're not feeding for 2, all right, unless she's lactating. In the last trimester, there's a significant increase in the requirement that this mare has for energy, calcium, phosphorus, trace minerals, most nutrients, in terms of trying to satisfy the nutrient requirements for fetal growth. Because most of the growth of the fetus, if you look at it graphically, is going to be in that last trimester. So I try to hit the sweet spot on this, and usually we'll have these mares on about 8 pounds of grain during late pregnancy. Now, it can be a little bit time of the year dependent. What I'll typically do is I will assess the condition of these mares October 1st. Why October 1st? October, November, December. All right, that's the last trimester. So the 1st of October, I'll assess these mares for their condition. Now, I'll say, okay, this mare is right where she ought to be, and maybe she probably needs a little bit of feed, or I'll say that this mare is too damn fat. I don't want to add any extra energy to her. And I'll manage them nutritionally based on that evaluation. So a lot of mares on good pasture that have been on good pasture through the fall, I'll put on 2 pounds of a very concentrated mixing pellet. And I don't know what, all feed companies have them. I don't know what they are up here. Grow and Win is an example. At home, M30. I know Purina has one, Pulling Grain. Who do you get your feed from? What's the other one up here? Nutrina. Nutrina has one, but there's another. Yeah, Triple Crown has one, Triple Crown 30, I think they call it. But all of these companies have a 25 to 30% protein mixing pellet that's typically 4% calcium, 2% phosphorus, 175 parts per million copper, 450 zinc, et cetera, et cetera. So these mares that are heavy, you're sitting there kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, because we know that in late pregnancy, her requirements for minerals and vitamins increase significantly. But she's fat. I don't want to feed her a bunch of energy. So if I can feed her that concentrate for a little while. I can make sure that I've met the requirement for these minerals and amino acids without making her fatter. And then by the time we get to 1st of December, 1st of January, we're going to have these mares eating a little feed and getting ready to foal because the pasture's gone, right? Pasture's gone at my house. Pasture's gone at Lane's End. And they were feeding hay. So I'll start to titrate in a little grain, hoping to have these mares eating about 7 to 8 pounds of feed per day when she foals, for a couple of reasons. One, to make sure I'm meeting requirements, and also to get the gut used to seeing that much feed. Now, that may be a little less than that for May foaling mares. Why is that? The pastures come on, all right? It may be a little bit more than that for January foaling mares or February foaling mares anyway, because of the effect of environmental temperature. But most of these mares I would like to be eating 7 to 8 pounds of feed late and around 2.5% of body weight. If I do that math, I actually overfeed this mare energy. But usually that's because of the impact of temperature on body temperature regulation, or the cost of energy for body temperature regulation. So that's either due to we've underestimated the requirements of this mare, or that there's a high cost for thermal regulation. And there is a fairly high cost for that. For lactating mares, how much milk does a mare produce? A gallon, 2 gallons, 3 gallons, 4 gallons? Typically, and it's pretty amazing because we've never really selected mares on the basis of her ability to produce milk. But a mare in early lactation will produce about 3.5% of her body weight per day in milk, in fluid milk. So let's go back from a math standpoint to that 1,000-pound mare. What's 3% of body weight? 30 pounds, isn't it? I know Jersey cows that don't give 30 pounds of milk per day. All right, so she's producing 35 pounds of milk per day, the theoretical 1,000-pound mare. How much does a quart of milk weigh? A gallon is 8 pounds, isn't it? A tick more, maybe not because of the fat. It's close. Quart weighs, a liter of milk weighs a kilo, all right? I know that. So a quart weighs about 2 pounds. And she's producing 35 pounds a day. So if that's 35 divided by 2 is 15, 16, 17 and a half, right? 17.5. So if you lined up 17 quart bottles of cartons of milk across there, then that's how much milk that mare is producing. 3.5% of her body weight. And that's for that's for a little mare. You take a big mare and the trail gets longer. All right, so she's producing a lot of milk. And producing that milk costs her a lot of nutrients, doesn't it? I mean, it's very nutrient intense. So this mare has significantly increased requirements for nutrients compared to other mares. Actually, probably the highest nutrient requirements of any horse there is, save horses in hard race training. All right. So average milk production, 3.5% in early lactation, 2.5% in late lactation. So lactation starts out high and then it tails off toward the end of lactation. And that's why typically I'll wean my foals at 5 months, is because it becomes a little bit more efficient for me to feed the mare and control nutrient intake to feed the foal than feed that mare. I'm not gonna make her produce a lot more milk in late lactation. Now, is there individual variation? Sure there is. A lot of individual variation. And how do you tell the individual variation between mares and milk production? Look at the foals. That's the way you do it. And if you got a big old heavy top, cresty, square-butted foal with a quart of water in that ridge going down his back, that little hollow thing, then this mare's producing a lot of milk, isn't she? If you got a mare that is thin, a foal that is thin, prominent withers, prominent neck, not as much cover over the hip, not doing as good, then that mare, and you look next to that foal and you got this big old fat mare, then she's cheating, isn't she? All right, so you need to make some adjustments in how you're gonna approach the nutritional program for the package. My inclination is to try to feed the foal earlier and not give that cheating wench anything to eat. Lactation affects rebreeding efficiency. So if you have a mare that's milking heavy and in a significant negative energy balance, then chances are the rebreeding efficiency on that mare is not going to be as good as if the mare is at least in a zero energy balance. So you need to try to feed this mare to at least kind of maintain weight early. What do I mean by adjustment of condition? If you got mares that are historically fat, this is one of the few times when in late lactation you can adjust her condition. In other words, trying to milk some fat off of this mare a little bit because she's going to try to produce milk. And a lot of us, fat's a pretty color, and we want our mares a little rounder and fatter than they need to be. But this is a perfect time, particularly from month 2 after you get this mare rebred until you wean, that you can marginalize intake, still get good milk production from the mare, but reduce the amount of fat that she has to cover to reduce her internal fat as well. So I use this time, and I use the time when mares are under lights or in the wintertime where pastures are bad if I want to regulate condition. Grain intake of the lactating mares is totally forage dependent. I have a farm in Ireland that would feed most of their mares, about lactating mares, January, February, March foaling mares, about 10 pounds of feed, 10 to 12 pounds of feed daily, plus good hay, what they call good hay. And then May foaling mares will be on pasture and 2 pounds of a mixing pellet. So the difference is that these mares that foal late in April or May, not many June foals in our country anyway, have access to a lot of pasture, and you can treat them nutritionally in a different manner than you will the January, February mares where the pasture is non-existent. So there's a lot of variation, totally dependent on the forage situation on a farm. The average intake in central Kentucky is somewhere between 8 and 14 pounds of feed per day for lactating mares, fed twice a day. I don't like it particularly like that, but sometimes, any time I exceed 5 pounds of feed in a feeding, I try to go to another feed. I just feel safer if I don't exceed 5 pounds of feed. So if I was feeding a mare 14 pounds of feed, I would not be feeding her 7 and 7. I'd be feeding her 5, 4, and 5, or probably 5, 5, and 5. Because I don't like to exceed 5 pounds feeding, because I think you can drive excess carbohydrate spilling over into the small intestine and have more problem with colic or other gut problems. In late lactation, you're reducing that significantly, and why is that? She's producing less milk, she's working less, and probably she's on better pasture and getting more of her requirements for forage. So, you would be adjusting this mare's feed throughout lactation. You shouldn't be feeding her to the same at the end of her lactation that you did at the front. The intake, as I said, is dependent on month fold, and that's going to be as a result of the amount of forage that they have access to, the amount of grass. So all of this is adjustable. It's like, how much do I feed my horse? Hell, I don't know. Tell me about it. Is it a lactating mare? When is she due to foal? What's your stocking rate? What kind of pasture? What kind of hay you're feeding? There isn't a rule. A pregnant mare must have 14% grain mix fed at X number of days. You can't do that because there's so many variables that work together that you as a owner or a breeder have to massage to get it right. The eye of the master fattens the ox. Did I go the wrong way? Okay, let's go with young horses now. And this is probably what most of you wanted to hear anyway. The young horses that we could categorize for thoroughbreds usually are foals, weanlings, and yearlings, because most of the yearlings have gone somewhere else by the time that they're older, unless you have a training center. I've got 6 yearlings left at the farm right now that are driving me crazy that I haven't sent off to get broke. And I used to tell Gonzalo, the guy at Three Chimneys, I said, it's ridiculous for you to send all these damn horses off in September to Ocala or South Carolina or wherever the hell you're going to send them, because some of these are late maturing horses and they'd be better off if you kept them until December and then send them, and you'd save 3 months of $100 a day money, breaking them down there, and it just makes sense. And I said, I've sent horses to my trainer in December of their 2-year-old year, of their yearling year, in March of their 2-year-old year, and in June of their 2-year-old year, and the son of a guns all start the same damn time. So why would you want these mares somewhere else paying a big board bill? And now I understand, because I have mine there too long. And like, the weanlings are supposed to be living where the yearlings are. And because the weanlings aren't living where the yearlings are, because the yearlings aren't gone, then the weanlings are living where the mares should be living, and the mares are holed up somewhere else. So you got this cycle that nobody has a place to sleep. And it makes them mad, and they tear up my damn pastures. So even though I'm right, it would be nice if we didn't have to start on these things. And the other thing that happens to you is that if you send a yearling to Ocala in September after the yearling sale, which is characteristically what we do, and you send them to people that make their living as pinhookers, but you're not pinhooking, you're not going to the 2-year-old sales, inevitably these yearlings fall into the same kind of program as the horses that are being pinhooked. So they're getting a similar amount of pressure as horses that are going to be sold in February or March or at Mid-Atlantic here as 2-year-old training horses. So you have to be very specific with some of these guys that I'm not going to a 2-year-old sale. I don't care if they start at Keeneland in April as a 2-year-old. Take it easy. But if you expose them to that 2-year-old in training mentality, sooner or later they slip into that same kind of a regimen and go faster than I would prefer them to go.